Welcome to this McKell Institute digital event series. My name is Ryan Batchelor. I'm the Executive Director of the McKell Institute here in Victoria, and we're really excited about today's discussion on disinformation, on internet cults and conspiracies, and what it means for democracy. And I think it's particularly important this week, as protesters still sit on the steps of Parliament House here in Victoria, but also as we ramp up towards a federal election in 2022. There'll be a Victorian state election in late 2022 and a New South Wales state election shortly thereafter. So there's a lot going on in the electoral cycle, and the topics of and the issue of disinformation and democracy is so critically important to our times. And we're joined today by two very special guests that I'll introduce in just a minute. Can I begin today's discussion by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're all zooming in from here today? I come to you from a Wurundjeri country in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects, and on behalf of the Institute, our respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are joining us on the call today. For those of you who haven't joined a McKell Institute digital event before, we're a think tank, an independent public policy research institute founded a decade ago in Sydney, and we've now got offices in Melbourne and Brisbane, and host a range of online, in-person events, produce reports. If you got here, you probably signed up to our email list. You may have got to us via social media. Make sure you stick around and take a look at the other things that we do and join us for some other conversations as well. Today, I'm joined by Van Badham and Nina Jankowicz, who are, in their own way, both experts on disinformation and conspiracies and what implications they have for our democracy. We're going to have a conversation here today. I'll ask Van and Nina some questions. We'll talk about what they've written and what they've learned about the topic, but also then open up to some questions from you. There's a Q&A function in the Zoom. I'm sure by now you're all very familiar with how that works. Put your questions in, and we'll have some time at the end to inject some of those questions over the course of the discussion. So what I might do first is just introduce our two guests. Van Badham, obviously, needs very little introduction, I would say, in Australian political circles, but she's a writer of both print and stage. She's a commentator, she's a unionist and feminist, and has just written a fantastic new book called QAnon and On, which is looking at the why, the how, and the who of the QAnon conspiracy, the rise of this internet cult, and what it means for our politics today. Nina Jankowicz is a global fellow at the Wilson Centre, a think tank specialising in foreign affairs, foreign and regional affairs, based just out of Washington, DC. She's written extensively on disinformation. This morning I was just reading a great piece that she's written in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs on why governments need to tackle disinformation in order to protect democracy. She's a book published recently called How to Lose the Information War, and wanted to tease out some of the issues that she's written about extensively in today's conversation. So Van, Nina, thank you so much both for joining us here today. I know, Nina, it's late evening in your part of the world. So
6 o'clock. I'll have some pizza after this. It's great. I'm happy to be here with Van, my dear friend, someone I admire so much. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic.
I am so excited to be doing a panel with Nina. I can't even.
We're very excited to have you both here. I thought I'd start, Van, just by asking you, you obviously written a book on QAnon and internet conspiracies. It is rocketing up the bestseller charts in Australian bookstores, which is fantastic to see. Can I ask you to give us a bit of what's the book about, and how did we get here? What made you get interested in the topic of internet conspiracies and QAnon, and what did you learn in writing that book?
Well, just before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal country today, and acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Australia is many nations, as we all know. I got interested in QAnon because I get a lot of abuse on the internet, which should be no surprise from people who've seen it. It can rather proliferate. And a couple of years ago, as I was going through the process of sort of because I file all the abuse I get because I have to for my safety and have some kind of record about who's attacking me and whatever. I started seeing this sort of pattern of apocalyptic language appearing in certain accounts that talked about this war between light and dark and referred to this sort of prophet entity called Q. And got interested and sort of followed this sort of strange internet phenomenon, asked a couple of people about it. And then there were a couple of articles that came out in the American press that were talking about it. And I was like, right, so this is a thing. There is an internet cult taking sort of political cues from a prophet that is mad. And as I sort of followed the story, my social media audience were increasingly writing to me saying, my brother, my cousin, my sister has fallen down an internet rabbit hole and is now spouting these kind of crazy beliefs about how Donald Trump is a god emperor who's trying to rescue kidnapped children from Satanist pedophiles led by Hillary Clinton. Can you help? It was like, I think that's maybe beyond me at this point, but you know, I did what I could and I did some research and I wrote an article for The Guardian saying, if people you love have fallen for an internet cult, this is what you do, and talked about the sort of the findings of psychologists and also importantly sociologists about how to de-radicalize people who are kind of in this space and maintain contact with them. And I put this article out and it went gangbusters, like it went everywhere. And thousands of people wrote to me telling me their stories of what had happened in their own families. And I was like, this is really interesting. I'm clearly going to do more stuff about this. But I got a phone call from Hardy Grant, who are the publisher, who said, do you think there's a book in this? And I was like, oh, I'm quite sure there are several books in these. And started the project of writing about this sort of specific internet cult and the effect that it was having on people's families. But of course, this was all happening in the wake of the 2019 federal election in Australia, an election that many of us were quite convinced that Labor would win and didn't. And as I wrote the book and did more research about how not only QAnon, but the Pizzagate conspiracy theory and the Frazzledrip conspiracy theory and the Gamergate controversy had really sort of built this amazing conspiracy-based disinformation infrastructure that as I got deeper into it, I realized was being weaponized by extremely cynical, bad faith political actors. So in my research, I created a bunch of internet personas and I went online and joined QAnon groups and joined anti-vax groups and joined all these different sort of intersecting conspiracy cults to get a handle on what that culture was like. And I realized that the involvement of the organized American right was blatant and that the organized Australian far right were engaged in that space as well. Like people like Craig Kelly and George Christensen and Bernie Finn emerge as major online characters in the discourse, the political discourse of these conspiracy groups that I'm in. And so looking at the disinformation context of the 2019 federal election in Australia, I started to tease out what are the relationships here between your tinfoil hat wearing uncle and the kind of people who were circulating unbelievably defamatory material about Bill Shorten over the course of the election. And how was it that the Australian Labor Party, one of the two dominant parties in this country, the official party of the centre left, how was it that Labor wasn't prepared for that kind of disinformation warfare? And it was in that context that my questions about QAnon and those sort of very personal relationships of believers to people who are trying to rescue them from the cult, that those sort of intimate stories became part of a much larger political narrative about how the right is using the internet to weaponize communities of people in ways that we've never seen before.
Who, in doing this research and in writing the book, who's falling into these cults? Who are the types of Australians that you discovered that are becoming susceptible? And is there anything in there that you can explain to us about sort of who and why people fall victim to this kind of behaviour?
Well, sure. And one of the really interesting experiences of writing the book was disabusing myself of my own notions. So like a lot of people, I read the articles that were coming out in 2015, 2016 about the Trump campaign that really portrayed Trump as this like blue collar billionaire, which was something that Sean Hannity from Fox News said to him, because that's apparently a thing, which is interesting given the whole prep school, Wharton millionaire family background of Trump. And certainly this image was created that Trump spoke for these disaffected working class people, you know, the blue collar base that had been displaced by globalization and deindustrialization. And this was the real energy behind the Trump campaign. And of course, over the past 5 years, we've learned that's not who the Trump base is. The Trump base is what we in Australian terms would call a middle class, like a bourgeois post-material class of people who had the money to take days off work and attend Trump rallies, who had the money to hire private jets and fly down to Washington, stay at the Hilton and try to overthrow a democratically elected government on their weekend. You know, and we know from the arrest records of January 6 protesters, they arrested real estate agents and guys who ran used car businesses and teachers and lawyers and nurses. And so you were looking at a white collar professional class base, small business people, and lower middle management types. There's an American conservative writer called Tom Nichols, who's part of the anti-Trump movement, who writes for The Atlantic, who resuscitated a long dormant political term to describe that sort of base, and it was the lumpen bourgeoisie, which I think is the best description of these people, people who have the time to invest in the sort of conspiracy belief and cult-like behavior and put resources behind this sort of conspiracy entrepreneurialism of the conferences and the conference circuits. These things are happening all the time. And that was quite a surprise for me. And certainly in the groups that I joined in disguise, I was encountering the same type of people. Like, these were generally disaffected small business people and lumpen bourgeoisie types who had who could satisfy all the material needs, especially in Australia, which is a prosperous country where we still have a health system and all of these social services hold. It was like, what are you so angry about? Like, what are you fighting against? I started calling them, the people in Melbourne, the anti-something protesters, because it's more the energy, the sort of tribal energy around demanding that they be the center of attention. Like, it's quite a narcissistic movement. Their demands are nebulous. It's, you know, like beyond hang Dan Andrews. Like, there aren't a lot of really comprehensive demands there, fighting against pandemic legislation that very few of them have read or even glanced at. But it's this, the appeal of this kind of conspiratorial thinking is of being the hero in your own story, of having this sort of vainglorious adventure of being a plucky maverick who's going there to Washington or going to Melbourne or standing outside Parliament House to sort of impose yourself over the democratically elected representatives of your community and take minority political positions and give them the appearance of a majority just by sort of the loudness of your voice and your willingness to engage in radical street theatre, like parading nooses down Spring Street. And that's really fascinating. And I don't think the left actually had a handle on that as the sociological tenet of this kind of Trumpian base, like, because these are, of course, the radical extremists of the Trumpian base. I think that we misread that. I think we looked at everything in a Marxist framework that went, people who are rebelling against authority and democracy in these institutions must be an oppressed class. And that's just not who they are. But as to who is vulnerable to persuasion into the conspiracy cults and into this algorithmic radicalization online, you know, start looking at organic food for your dog and then end up trying to overthrow the Biden administration. And that's a term from Joshua Roos, who's the Australian disinformation expert, about how the platforms have led people into these rabbit holes. A lot of the people I looked at in the book were comfortable middle-class people who had had an experience of status disruption in their life and had a lot of status anxiety. People who had, for example, suffered an adverse legal finding or confronted a bankruptcy or been in a messy divorce or a child custody battle, something that had given them this sense of precarity about their material comfort, were people who were very susceptible to these sort of crazy narratives about, you know, we're going to save the children and be heroes and be white hats and, you know, take over the world and the rest of it. And a lot of the people who had come out the other side talk about how it was individual distress that led them into susceptibility to propaganda and radicalization, but who came out of it because of a sociological intervention, that the society that was created for them with other conspiracy believers and this constant immersion. And as somebody who's been hiding in that space, like, the propaganda is intense. It's not every couple of minutes, it's every couple of seconds. Like, if you're on a Telegram channel that's sharing this kind of material, every 2 seconds you have something new to be terrified of. And certainly when they're enmeshed in that, it's very difficult for them to see a way out. And it's the personal connections that they maintain that eventually help them get out of that particular mindset.
Interesting. It seems like it's a fear of losing what you've got rather than people who don't have and are trying to build up. You know, I think it's a really interesting observation. Nina, if I can bring you in on your perspective and experience of the rise of this type of conspiracy theory, the rise of this kind of extremism, and the role that information and disinformation has played. If you can talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done and the work you've looked at, both in America and also internationally. I think that'd be really interesting for our guests.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start just by saying that if you haven't picked up a copy of Van's book yet, you must do so. I was lucky enough to see some of the early chapters and read them, and I was just really taken in. I mean, in the United States, we have been kind of really hit over the head with a lot of the QAnon narrative in the media, and Van tells it in such an interesting and fresh way with a perspective that I think anybody can really get behind. And it reads more like a thriller than it does a nonfiction book about things that have actually happened. So please pick it up. I'm going to start with something that I think is kind of tangential to what Van was just talking about who is susceptible to these narratives. And I think the short answer is that almost anybody can be, because right now we have, as I've seen in my own research, the ability, if you have a social media account, to target anybody based on their vulnerability. Whether you've had a drug addiction in the past, or as Van said, gone through a messy divorce, or any other random slice of your life, that is available to micro-targeters and advertisers on the internet, whether it's not on Facebook or it's just on one of the ad exchanges that exists here in the United States or elsewhere. There is a ton of personal information out there. And that makes it very easy for both QAnon conspiracy theorists, political advertisers, or foreign adversaries to target you. And that's what Russia has gotten very good at. That's what a lot of my research was focused on. But more recently, in the COVID era, which I guess we can now call it since we're 2 years into this pandemic, I've seen what I like to call conspiracy convergence. So we had the reopen movement, and I know you've had your own taste of that in Australia. That was quite big, especially in the early pandemic for us here in the United States. Different protests happening at state capitals. And in my own home state of New Jersey, there was quite a robust reopen movement that I did some research into, because a man who graduated from my high school and owned a gym in my hometown was friends with my brother. They had, I think, played on a football team together, American football, not what everyone else calls football. My brother said, "Hey, you should check out this guy. He's leading a protest against the coronavirus restrictions." And so I started following him on Facebook and joining groups and looking into kind of the people who were supporting him. And what was really interesting about this man, and this is a piece in The Atlantic if you want to check it out. I think it's called How an Anti-Shutdown Celebrity is Made. He wasn't in it for any conspiratorial or political reasons. He just wanted to open his gym again, and he thought he could do it safely, providing outdoor or spaced workouts. And his family was hurting by not being able to open his gym. But what happened is that all of these conspiracy theorists and political operators glommed onto his movement, because he had done one appearance on Fox News and went viral in a bunch of Facebook groups, including some anti-vaccination groups, some alternative health groups, one QAnon group. And suddenly, as he described it, they were playing Bruce Springsteen at the reopening rally in front of his gym, and somebody was there waving a QAnon flag. And so this micro-targeting helps this conspiracy convergence, where you could be thinking that you're looking for alternative health remedies, and within a few clicks, because of the suggestion algorithms on Facebook, because of the behavior patterns that social media companies use to amplify certain content and to keep us engaged, keep us clicking on that content, you could be quickly in a white supremacist group, a QAnon group, or a violent, neo-Nazi group, very, very easily. So that's what's going on in the United States. From the foreign interference angle, which is my lens on all of this, I'm actually a lot less worried about foreign interference, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, in the United States or in Australia, than I am about the domestic disinformation situation. And here's why. For the most part, those foreign actors aren't smart enough, aren't clever enough, aren't capable enough to create disinformation narratives whole cloth. What they do is make a study of what's going on in our countries, a sociological study, if you will. Russia has even sent operatives here from the Internet Research Agency to kind of visit swing states and understand those key issues that they're going to amplify. And they think about those fissures in society, those really hot button issues that polarize people. And those are the things that they're putting out. They're not creating narratives whole cloth. They're not really creating fake news. They are seizing on the issues that we ourselves are creating and perpetuating, and amplifying those. So the COVID narratives that we've seen weren't created in the Russian Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. They've started in fringe groups and were amplified by Russia. Same with QAnon. A lot of people ask me if QAnon is a Russian conspiracy theory. No, but Russia is very, very happy to amplify it. And we've seen the same thing in Central and Eastern Europe. A lot of my work has focused on Ukraine in particular. Russia is a great study of the countries that it wishes to target. And so the best thing that we can do, and I know this is kind of an eye roll of an answer, but the best thing that we can do to fight disinformation is have better governance, really listen to people's grievances and issues, and apply some of that thinking that Van talks about so beautifully in her work, both in the Guardian article and in her book, about how to reach people. We can't isolate people. We can't say, you know, these are just silly folks and we have to leave them behind. How do we reach them? Through better governance, through information literacy programs, and the countries that have done well fighting disinformation and conspiracy theories all have embraced that sort of work. So I'll stop there for now.
No, that's fantastic. One of the things that the phrase I picked up, I can't remember exactly where I got it from, but it was in some of the work that had been written, was this concept of the consequences of this is that we are clearly making truth unknowable. That the way that disinformation is working is that people no longer have a reference point where they know what's true or not, so that anything that they hear and see and that taps a nerve and that meets a grievance or an insecurity, they latch onto. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about how you think the kind of shifts in, it's not just shifts in media, but the shifts in how we discuss things have affected the concept of truth and information and disinformation. That if we don't know who to listen to anymore, and where truth comes from, how do we cope with that in the sort of modern public sphere?
Well, I think the democratization that the internet provides, on the one hand, is like this beautiful thing, right? Anybody can be a journalist, anybody can get their voice out there and make their opinion heard. But that also means that the content curation that many generations have been so used to on the nightly news or on the radio doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. And people are going to trust the information that they see in a Facebook group full of their online friends, or perhaps the soccer moms from down the street, more than they're going to trust the quote unquote mainstream media. Couple that with the fact that, especially here in the United States, I just saw more statistics about this. I think 54% of journalism jobs disappeared since 2008 in the United States, which is just mind blowing. I think fewer than half of US states have an accredited reporter at the US Capitol. So we don't have local news the same way we did anymore. And I really see local news as the connective tissue between people and what's going on here in Washington or in other big cities. So without that kind of barometer, why should somebody in Iowa have any idea what's going on or how it affects them, how democracy is working for them in Washington? And I think that's something that we've really lost. Plus, as Van and I have both experienced, and I'll just plug my upcoming book here, How to Be a Woman Online, the abuse that exists online, not just for women and people of color, but in general, this idea that you must be right all the time, that an argument is always winnable, that we really lose all of this nuance. That leads us to believe that there's always a right answer, right? And it's our side, and we're going to be ensconced in this filter bubble, if you will. And we can't have that sort of civil discourse anymore, because it's not what the internet engenders. The algorithms are going to have us be more engaged with the most enraging content. That's what's most engaging online. So all of those things together lead us to not have a democratic discussion anymore. And I'm really interested in these sorts of programs that actually put people face to face to hash these things out, because often you'll have a much more civil discourse then. And frankly, sometimes when I'm feeling very, what's the word, magnanimous with my abusers online, I will private message them and say, hey, like, I'm a person. My dad was a veteran. He died from cancer. Tell me about you. Like, how do you think that abusing me online is going to solve any of your problems? It's very rarely that I feel like that. But sometimes that sort of human approach works. And I think so much of how we communicate has lost all of that. And with that truth being unknowable, this is a quote from Peter Pomerantsev, I think you're referring to, Ryan. He has a book called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. It's a great book that talks about how Russia perfected its domestic disinformation machine. And really that gets at the heart of what disinformation is about. It's not necessarily about a political outcome. It's about undermining the functioning of democracy, because without truth, how can we participate in a way that makes sense at the voting booth? How do we believe that our vote is going to be counted? How do we believe that the infrastructure of democracy is working for us? We're not going to believe that. And without that participation, democracy doesn't work.
Van, you mentioned in comments you made earlier about the role that some really senior Australian figures are playing in the spread of disinformation online in particular, and the cycles that they appear to be actively perpetuating. And I think I want to talk a little bit about, ask you really about the notion of responsibility and where you see the nation's leaders, what role you think they have as responsible holders of public office or significant persons in the community. What role do you think they need to play in dealing with some of these issues?
Well, it's a really tough one, Ryan, because in Australia, certainly the centre-right has temporarily been benefiting from the disinformation infrastructure that's been built in this country. They had an electoral benefit, a tangible electoral benefit in the 2019 federal election from disinformation that was being shared online. That happened. So what their motivation would be to actually clean up those pipelines and take a proactive role in redressing online disinformation. There's nothing in that for them apart from the health of the democracy in which we live. Now, as the far right entrench themselves in the centre right, and we know that there are far right incursions going on with Liberal and National parties. We know that neo-Nazis tried to take over the National Party in New South Wales. Like, we know that. We know that there have been stacks in the Liberal Party branches in Victoria, and Josh Frydenberg, who's our treasurer, Nina, who you would really have as the poster boy for the centre right in Australia, you know, successful, like from sort of a leafy burb, sort of quite, you know, economically conservative, socially progressive kind of person. And really in that tradition of the Australian Liberal Party, his people are losing pre-selections. Like, the Malcolm Turnbull got rolled, Julia Banks got driven out of the Liberal Party. These are the kind of Liberals who represent that sort of centre-right territory, whereas a hard-right incursion is shifting the dynamics within the Liberal Party and the National Party. So maybe as that starts to bite, we might get a willingness for more action from the Liberals, but quite realistically, what was done, the smearing of Bill Shorten in the last election, was incredibly beneficial to them, as were the internet campaign that tried to convince Australians that Labor were going to introduce a death tax, which had never been Labor policy, and where they didn't even change the figures from the anti-death tax campaign that Steve Bannon had run for Donald Trump in various electorates in the United States in 2016. They didn't even change the text of this American material that was being used. I get to recommend Nina's book, How to Lose the Information War, now, because Nina has like a comprehensive policy prescription for what governments can do. And certainly some governments, like in Scandinavia, are taking this very seriously. Of course, the context of a place like Finland that teaches information literacy to high school students, and who prepares generations of their children for what information war looks like, has, of course, since the end of the Second World War, lived in the shadow of Soviet and then post-Soviet disinformation campaigns, with Russian television broadcast into every Finnish home. And a resilience against propaganda has really been built into that kind of community. That being said, they have lessons to teach us about how there is a public policy opportunity to teach information literacy, to crack down on platforms, to regulate. And various countries do this in various ways. Germany, of course, has extremely strict legislation about what is permissible on Facebook and how those algorithms are allowed to work. But I do want to tell a story that sort of illustrates that these are not isolated disinformation campaigns. Like there is an international network of communication around people who have shared political beliefs. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about in the wake of January 6th, actually on January 6th, about what happened with the disinformation narrative that was seized that day. Now, we know it was the far-right Trump supporters who attacked the Capitol building. Like, we know that, we can identify them. We know there was a direct correlation between the events on the ellipse and Trump appearing, and then the march up to the Capitol and the people who broke into that building. We know that, like that is demonstrable fact. But literally within minutes of it being quite obvious that January 6th was not going to overthrow the government, that it would be put down, disinformation began on Twitter, where a right-wing sort of social media personality started insisting that it was Antifa and anti-fascists and Extinction Rebellion who were committing some kind of false flag operation at the Capitol building. And yeah, he was totally sure it was Antifa. This tweet got reshared by the guy who had replaced Rush Limbaugh in the Rush Limbaugh Hour on his radio show, and he started sharing, going, oh, well, you know, I've read that it's Antifa. This got picked up by the people online who, and notably the the Washington Times, actually, which is the newspaper of the Moonies, of the Sun Myung Moon Church. They ran an article that they started sharing through all of their internet networks saying, oh, the company that pioneered facial recognition software has identified these people who are in this photo as being Antifa and Extinction Rebellion protesters, not Trump supporters. So this is a false flag operation. Now, within 2 hours, the company that made the facial recognition software, who are based in Singapore, were onto this immediately and went, this is completely untrue. We demand an apology. We are issuing a concerns notice. You will take this material down and issue an apology. And of course, the Washington Times fought this and was getting legal opinions and whatever, but this company were putting out statements saying, this is not true, this did not happen. Cue an appearance of George Christensen, an Australian MP who stands up in our parliament and gives a speech, which is recorded, which nobody in Australia takes seriously because he's a fairly known quantity, George Christensen. But he uses this discredited, legally challenged article that is communicating untrue information, the context of the radio broadcaster and this discussion online, to say that Antifa was behind January 6th. The footage of George Christensen is picked up by Fox News in the United States, and a narrative forms on the right in the United States. Well, if this responsible, independent Australian parliamentarian has information that says that, you know, these are Antifa people, well, clearly this is true. And that evening, when the police are still surrounding the Capitol building, they've brought in the National Guard. Matt Gaetz, who's a congressional representative from Florida, he stands up in the very building that has just been attacked and repeats the disinformation. And an Australian politician was part of that. George Christensen took an active role in the perpetration of a disinformation narrative that was, you know, desperate and of the moment. And I don't think we should be naive to think that just randomly happened, like he just saw something on Facebook and reacted to it. I think we have to be very honest about the fact that vested political interests are weaponizing the internet in order to advance specific political objectives and goals.
One of the things that, I mean, as a Melburnian who saw what was going on outside our Parliament House, and the echoes to what we saw in Melbourne, what we saw in DC and the Capitol riots on January 6th. I mean, it was scary, right? Like, to think that sort of behavior is infecting our politics, and that people are willing, that political leaders or political representatives, elected representatives, are willing to stand up and cozy up to that kind of activity. I think that feels
yesterday, Michael Gunner, who's the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, gave a press conference in which he broke down when he admitted that there have been death threats issued against his 2-year-old child. And of course, the context for the targeting of Michael Gunner is this is Michael Gunner who called out US Senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, when Ted Cruz was trying to make a propaganda example and calling the Northern Territory a totalitarian dictatorship because of its lockdown laws. And Gunner called him out, saying that we are the home of the oldest continuing existing culture on earth. You know, like, Indigenous people in the Northern Territory have 200,000 years of culture that we are going to protect from a killer virus. We will take whatever protections are necessary. We are democratically elected to do that, and we will keep our people safe, and called him out and made Cruz look like the nitwit he is. But of course, the punishment for that has been an activation of American right-wing actors and cruise defenders who have been encouraging behaviour online that has now led to a death threat on Michael Gunner's 2-year-old child.
Seems to me that there needs to be some, from the top, some pretty serious leadership and commentary and action taken to make sure that those things don't perpetuate here. Nina, I wanted to just ask a little bit about sort of what the really what the fallout and the consequences have been, if any, really post the Capitol riots. There was an investigation. There was some sort of hearings. I'd maybe talk a little bit about sort of, it was a big moment for the US, those images, and then what's happened afterwards. Because I think for us here, it's interesting to see how the reaction of the political establishment has been to those shocking images and those shocking events, and what we might need to learn from that.
I wish I had better news for you. January 6th for me was a really, really dark day. And I think for many Americans, but certainly as a Washingtonian, I've lived here for 10 years and spent a lot of time in the Capitol building, both giving testimony, briefing members of Congress, doing various events there, and also as a disinformation researcher. I think the thing that is most worrisome to me is not even the disinformation angle of all of this. It is the fact that the Capitol building and the Capitol complex, if you've not been, I think is pretty unique in that in all the other parliaments and government buildings I've visited around the world, you need, a clearance to get in, you need to be cleared, you need to be on the roll. You could just walk into the Capitol. You could walk into your senator's office or your congressperson's office on any day. And the fact that during a global pandemic, after a very clean and safe election, people felt the need to deface that building and levy threats against democratically elected lawmakers that didn't even represent them, when they could have called up their representative on a normal day, a non-pandemic day, just walked into their office, which I'm sure many of the January 6th protesters didn't even know. That is the scariest thing. And it's something that we'll never get back here in the United States. Something that kind of transparency and openness that we stood for, I think is gone for a long time. And there's been a lot of discussion in Washington about, is the fence going to stay up? Is it down? It's down right now, but sometimes it comes back up. It's really saddening. And it's a visual example of the unfortunate reaction we've had to have just for the safety of the people who work on Capitol Hill. So that is one tangible reaction. Unfortunately, as Van already pointed out, Matt Gaetz and his ilk on January 6th, the evening of, had already started their disinformation campaign against the truth coming out about what had happened. We saw some representatives still vote to decertify the election that evening. And the Republicans on Capitol Hill have blocked a fulsome investigation into what has happened. There is a committee that exists, a special committee on January 6th. Some Republicans are cooperating with the investigation, including former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Steve Bannon is now being held in contempt of Congress for not cooperating. So we'll see what comes out of that. But with the division that exists on Capitol Hill, I do not think we will see a fulsome investigation. And frankly, it was disappointing to me to see the degree to which the second impeachment of President Trump was politicized. At that point, the Republican argument was, what is this going to achieve except divide us further? And I think the answer is it would set the record straight. It would set the truth straight and show what Congress stands for rather than just pandering to the electorate. The Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body. It's supposed to be the one that keeps the check on the House, which is more responsive to their constituents, right? And we've completely lost that in the United States, unfortunately. So I think the repercussions from January 6th, unfortunately, have been a further entrenchment of disinformation. We are seeing a little bit of movement on the social media regulation question in Congress. And I think that is less because of January 6th and more because Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, has shed light on how children are being affected by social media. And if there's one thing Republicans need to stand up for, it is the rights of children. So we have seen some consensus on that, and I'm happy to see something moving in that direction. But unfortunately, we still have this giant vacuum that the United States has left, both for its own people and then leadership in the world on this issue. And nobody faces any consequences for telling these lies or levying hate speech or the abuse that Van and I experienced online. And that's not just because the social media companies aren't doing anything, which they're not. It's because there is no consequence, even at the highest levels of government. We've just seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez killed in effigy in a silly cartoon by one of her fellow congresspeople. And there was a vote to censure him, but there weren't consequences beyond that. We're seeing similar abuse against Ilhan Omar now. Until we have real consequences for those who represent us, how can any normal American be expected to hold themselves to a higher standard? I hope, and as I wrote in Foreign Affairs this week, to see more elected officials around the world, more representatives of democracies taking pledges not to use disinformation, deep fakes, and manipulated media in their campaigns, not to use automated trolls and bots in order to amplify information. But so far, there's only a few hundred political representatives around the world who have done that. And we not only need to see that, but we need to see democracies coming together to stand up against foreign interference and to put pressure on so-called democracies that are using these tactics. We see it at a government kind of systemic level in places like the Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, the Republic of Georgia. This is the most urgent democratic issue to me. It is at the bedrock of every domestic crisis that we see right now, from COVID to immigration. And if we don't solve it, we are going to be kicking ourselves very, very soon. And in fact, I already am.
Which brings me neatly to sort of finalizing questions, last few questions. We asked people to submit some questions for you ahead of the session, and we had quite a few, and there's a lot on this theme. And I just want to read you out some of these phrases. Any effective pushback? What can we do to try and fight the misinformation without pushing the protesters further away? How do we combat the power of misinformation? What can we do to stop the spread? And we've had one today. What are the best examples of positive consensus building? Like, people clearly want to do something about this. To borrow a quote from an old German guy, like, we can interpret the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Like, what do we do? What can
Love that guy.
What can we do about this? What can governments do about this? But I think, like, what can we as citizens do about this?
So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a resource that I really like from a British fact-checking charity called Full Fact. They have a toolkit of what people can do to kind of check their sources of information that I think is very helpful. But it really boils down to this idea that we are all on the front lines of the information war, right? And even if you think yourself very, very well educated and savvy about the media that you consume, there are still ways that we can be manipulated online. Have you ever bought something from an Instagram ad? Guilty, right? You're being manipulated, you're being targeted too. So I think we just need to go into these online experiences understanding that fact, number one. Number two, if something is getting you really emotional or enraged, it's a good idea to put some distance between yourself and that piece of content, whether it's a troll yelling at you, because we all know that what they want is for us to get mad, right? Or whether it's a really sad article about animal abuse somewhere. The idea is to make you emotional. So first, put some space between yourself and that content. If it's still bothering you in a couple of minutes, come back to it. You can do what Full Fact says, check the source, see what's missing, see if the journalist, if it's posing as a news article, see what they've written, and if they have a legitimate online profile, see what other news outlets are reporting, if it's a breaking news story, because a lot of times we see bogus stuff happening, especially in fast moving events. teach yourself how to do a reverse image search, which is the simplest thing you can do to protect yourself from manipulated or misattributed media online. If you're using the Chrome browser, it's just a right click and then search Google for image. And often we see, especially Russia or the far right, misattributing images from different conflicts around the world and saying, oh, this is from Ukraine today, or this is a protest happening right now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, but actually it's something from the LA riots in the 90s, right? So that's a really good way. Google will show you the earliest instance of that image, especially if we're looking at visual media. All of these little checks, yes, it slows down your online browsing experience. It's making you stop and take stock, but that's really the most important thing that we can do, because once disinformation purveyors put this stuff out into the ecosystem, we're the ones that are amplifying it, generally speaking. Gone really are the days of trolls and bots. They're not as pervasive as they used to be, because thankfully the social media platforms are getting better at detecting them. This is all about organic amplification and authentic local users who are getting sucked in by the disinformation. So you are the best bulwark to all of that. And then everything Van was talking about before about listening to your friends and family if they've been sucked in by this, I think is hugely, hugely important. I don't know, maybe Van wants to share some of those tips now.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I learned from the research I did was that the worst thing you can do if somebody in your family has gone down the rabbit hole is to argue facts with them, because somebody who wants to believe that Hillary Clinton is squatting under the pizza restaurants of Washington eating children is someone who's not really that interested in facts. They're interested in narratives, and they're interested in feelings, and they're interested in heroes and villains. And psychologists actually call the psychological state of believing in conspiracy theories the paranoid schizoid position. And I talk about this a lot in the book, about how when people are in distress and feel overwhelmed by information, of course, the internet is pretty overwhelming as far as information goes, that they gravitate towards a simplification. They want good, bad, light, dark narratives so they can feel more in control and more secure in their environment. And of course, what happens if they're targeted by this micro-targeting that Nina talks about, whether it's an Instagram ad for perhaps a jumper that looked a lot cuter before you bought it, or anything else, what happens, we've all been there, what happens, of course, is that the process of radicalization sets in, and they end up in a sealed information environment where they are consuming propaganda all the time with absolutely no contradiction to it. And you trying to argue them out of that position is one of the worst things you can do, because you recruit yourself into the role of the antagonist or the enemy, this sort of, the opposite side of the polarization that they've decided to adopt. And the advice that I put in the book is that keeping contact alive with these people is really important, and being the antidote to a sealed environment, not through arguing the facts or pressing the case, but by gently sowing doubt, going, oh, I've heard differently, and questions like that, but also just re-socializing people. In Australia, this has been a problem because we had such long and severe lockdowns that people were literally trapped in their houses with the internet and a whole bunch of neo-fascists who were trying to radicalize them into violence. And they are the people who are on the steps of Parliament House. But if we want to take a community and social responsibility for that, it is helping other people to re-socialize and reintegrate. It is being aware that sealed information environments make people completely beholden to propaganda. But I want everyone to remember that this is a minority. It's a dangerous minority, like any radical extremist movement that is talking about violence. And make no mistake, if they are threatening the 2-year-old child of the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, they're certainly immersed in narratives of violence. And we've had those arrests in Victoria about people making bombs and bringing weapons to protests. We know that there are active threats to kill the Premier of Victoria. We know that's happening. But at the same time, the Premier of Victoria is experiencing some of the highest poll approval ratings of all time. He is sitting conservatively at 58-42, and various pollsters online were saying, we think that's an understatement. We think it's probably more 60-61. These are unheard of poll numbers in Australia. The other thing I want Australians to be very aware of is that in the United States, these radical movements are deployed to intimidate people away from the ballot boxes, that there is a real political risk communicated to people on voting and participating in democracy that disenfranchises particularly marginalised communities. In Australia, we don't have that because we have compulsory voting, and because the legal obligation on the Australian government is to ensure ballot access to every Australian. It means that intimidation from the ballot boxes is not a factor in our politics here, and we can be quite democratically resilient to attempts to politically intimidate people, even if they are as gross as attacks on Michael Gunner or Daniel Andrews. That being said, there is a movement in the Parliamentary Liberal Party at the moment. James Patterson has been suggesting legislation to bring in an optional preferential voting system and to change the very bulwark against extremism that is built into the universal enfranchisement of Australians with an independent Australian Electoral Commission and all of our voting protection. So make no mistake, attempts to water down universal enfranchisement and compulsory voting, attempts to kick people off electoral rolls, they are importing the suite of problems from America that is causing American democracy so many problems. And if people want to do anything, it is to scream blue murder at any politician who tries to water down our enfranchisement.
Very true, very true. I feel like I could keep talking all morning because I'm really enjoying this conversation, but we've reached the end of our time in this. I just want to thank both of you, Van and Nina, for excellent insights, perspectives that you've brought here today. For those of you who have really enjoyed the conversation, there's nothing better you can do than going and buying both of these books and reading them and sharing them with your friends. Christmas is coming. Books are a great present, particularly books that are about informing people about information and what we can do to make sure that our democracy is healthy, particularly as we here in Victoria and in Australia come out of a pretty grueling 2-year pandemic era. And as we head into what is going to be a very consequential 2022, as I mentioned, there's some really important elections coming on next year. I think some of the issues that we've been dealing with today about how our democracy is working and how information is circulating are going to be really critical in how those elections are conducted. Here at the McKell Institute, we're really proud to bring you, our members and supporters, these sorts of events to inform you about some of these critical issues in politics and policy and how they impact on our lives. If you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, the conversations that we're having about politics and policy in Australia and with some friends that we have internationally, make sure you sign up to our email list and register, and make sure you tune in to our future digital events. Hopefully in 2022, we'll get back in person and be having some conversations in the flesh again as we emerge from this period of spending way too much time at home with our phones. And judging by the latest sets of national accounts, clicking far too often on those ads and telling us that are encouraging us to buy things. So please, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Please have a safe rest of 2021. Get out, engage with your friends and family again. As Van has said, that's probably one of the most critical ways.
The best thing you can do is go bowling, because bowling, things are going on, everybody's got something to do, it's very casual, it's not conducive to political conversations or arguments. So like bowling, it will literally save democracy. And Ryan, can I just say on behalf of Nina and myself, thanks for hosting us and thanks for platforming this discussion. I really appreciate the work that McKell does. I think you're one of the great institutions defending Australian democracy, and I think that's fantastic. And I also want everybody to pre-order Nina's book, How to Be a Woman Online, because even though the things we talk about are quite serious, as feminists who are online, we've had to develop a lot of resilience and humor about pursuing what we do. And Nina's book is actually hilarious, so you must buy it.
In large part due to the interview I conducted with Van. So thank you, Van. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you to the McKell Institute for a great talk.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon.